Imagine waking up each day feeling rushed before you even open your eyes. The clock is already ticking faster than you can keep up. Deadlines loom, notifications buzz, and the noise of a world that never seems to stop fills every corner of your life. Sound familiar? We live in a time where speed is praised, multitasking is the norm, and busyness wears the badge of honor. But beneath this frenzy lies a quiet question begging to be heard. Is this really how we want to live? What if the secret to a more meaningful, peaceful life isn't found in doing more, faster, or better, but in slowing down? Not just physically, but in our minds, our hearts, and our very way of being. The ancient teachings of the Buddha offer a profound invitation to step out of the relentless rush. Slow living, according to the Buddha, is far more than a trendy lifestyle choice. It's a path, a practice, and a state of mind that leads to clarity, contentment, and awakening. It challenges the modern obsession with speed and productivity, revealing that true happiness arises from presence, balance, and compassion. You might be wondering, how does a teaching from over 2.5 millennia ago speak so powerfully to our chaotic lives today? Because at its core, the Buddha's message addresses the very human struggle with stress, dissatisfaction, and disconnection. Struggles that are only amplified in our fast-moving world. Slow living in the Buddhist sense invites us to cultivate mindfulness, to fully inhabit the present moment instead of being swept away by past regrets or future anxieties. It encourages us to notice the small wonders often missed in the rush, the warmth of sunlight on our skin, the rhythm of our breath, the kindness in a stranger's eyes. This way of living is not about laziness or withdrawal from life, but about awakening to it more deeply. This journey begins with understanding that life's pace is not just a matter of external circumstances, but also an internal choice. The Buddha taught that much of our hurry comes from attachment and craving, endless desires pulling us forward, never letting us rest. When we slow down, we begin to loosen these bonds, opening space for peace and insight. As we explore this path, you'll discover practical wisdom that can be woven into your daily routine, from mindful breathing to compassionate action, from embracing impermanence to finding the middle way between extremes. So what does it truly mean to live slowly according to the Buddha? It's an art, the art of being present, the art of living with intention, and the art of awakening. This art offers a sanctuary amid the storm of modern life, guiding us back to ourselves and to a deeper connection with the world around us. Join me as we step gently onto this path, exploring how ancient Buddhist wisdom can transform our hurried lives into journeys of calm, clarity, and meaning. There's a simple power in just being, not doing, not rushing, not chasing. This power lies at the heart of the Buddha's teachings, mindfulness, or as it's known in Pali, sati. It's more than a meditation technique or a buzzword in wellness circles. Mindfulness is a doorway into truly living. Imagine for a moment how often your mind drifts away from the present. Maybe you're sitting in traffic, but your thoughts are tangled in yesterday's worries or tomorrow's plans. Or you're eating a meal, but your attention is elsewhere, on your phone, on your to-do list, or on the noise around you. When this happens, life passes by like a fleeting shadow, unnoticed and unappreciated. The Buddha taught that this absent-mindedness is a root cause of suffering. When we are not present, we become prisoners of distraction, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. Our minds race ahead or cling to the past, never at peace with what is. Mindfulness is the gentle practice of bringing your attention back to the here and now, without judgment or resistance. It's like a calm lighthouse in the storm of thoughts, guiding you back to the shore of your experience. Whether it's the breath entering and leaving your body, the sensations of your feet touching the ground, or the sounds filling the air, mindfulness anchors you in reality, in what is real and immediate. But mindfulness isn't about forcing the mind to be still or empty. It's about watching the flow of thoughts, emotions, and sensations with curiosity and kindness. This subtle awareness opens space between stimulus and response, allowing you to choose your actions with clarity rather than react out of habit or impulse. The Buddha's own practice was rooted in mindfulness. He encouraged his followers to cultivate it steadily in all moments, while walking, eating, working, and resting. This continuous awareness transforms ordinary moments into opportunities for awakening. One of the most powerful tools to cultivate mindfulness is meditation. Yet, meditation is not an escape from life. It is a deeper engagement with it. In stillness, we begin to see the patterns of our mind, how craving arises, how aversion grips us, how thoughts come and go. This insight leads to freedom, because understanding the mind's workings reduces our reactivity and helps us live with greater calm. Beyond meditation, the Buddha emphasized presence in daily life. It's the art of fully participating in whatever you do. Washing dishes becomes an act of mindfulness. Listening to a friend becomes a moment of deep connection. Walking becomes a dance with the earth beneath your feet. Presence also opens the door to gratitude. When we slow down and notice life as it unfolds, we begin to appreciate the small blessings, the warmth of a morning sunbeam, the laughter of a child, the gentle breeze. These moments, often overlooked, become threads weaving a rich tapestry of contentment. What's more, mindfulness sharpens our ability to recognize suffering in ourselves and others with clarity and compassion. When we are present, we see pain without turning away or reacting with fear. This awareness nurtures empathy and kindness, core qualities in Buddhist practice. The practice of mindfulness is a lifelong journey. It asks us to return again and again to the present moment, to wake up from the autopilot of busyness and distraction. It is a radical act of self-care and self-discovery in a world that constantly pulls us away. As you begin to cultivate mindfulness in your life, you may notice something remarkable. The very pace of life begins to slow down, not because the world changes, but because your relationship to it shifts. You become less driven by restlessness and more guided by calm attention. In this way, the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness and presence lay the foundation for slow living. They teach us that slowing down is not about escaping life, but about engaging with it fully, deeply, and with open-hearted awareness. With mindfulness, every moment becomes a doorway to peace. And through presence, we find that life's richness is not in rushing toward some distant goal, but in the simple, profound experience of now. There's a hidden force that keeps us racing through life, often without even realizing it. It's not the clock, the calendar, or even the noise of the outside world. It's something deeper, something that stirs inside us and whispers, more, faster, better. This force is desire, and its close companion, attachment. The Buddha taught that these two, desire and attachment, are at the root of much of our suffering, including the restless hurry that fills our days. When we examine our lives closely, we often find ourselves caught in a web of wanting. We want more success, more comfort, more approval, more time, and more meaning. These cravings pull us forward like an invisible current, rushing us through each moment as if the next achievement or possession will finally bring peace. But here's the paradox. Chasing after what we desire rarely satisfies us. Instead, it fuels a cycle of craving and disappointment. We grasp tightly at fleeting things, only to find they slip away or lose their appeal. This grip on impermanent things creates tension and unease, pushing us to hurry through life in a desperate attempt to hold on. Attachment doesn't just mean clinging to material objects. It's also about our identities, our ideas, and even our emotions. We get attached to how we think life should be, how we want others to see us, and how we expect things to turn out. When reality doesn't match these attachments, frustration and anxiety arise, urging us to act faster, control more, and avoid discomfort at all costs. In Buddhist philosophy, this restless hurry is seen as a symptom of tanha, craving. This craving is not inherently evil. It's a natural part of being human. But unchecked, it blinds us to the beauty of the present and traps us in a constant cycle of dissatisfaction. So, How do we break free from this pattern? The Buddha's answer lies in awareness and release. By recognizing our desires and attachments as they arise, without judgment or resistance, we create a space where we can choose a different response. This isn't about suppressing desire or becoming indifferent to life's joys. Rather, it's about seeing clearly how clinging to these desires fuels our hurry and learning to let go, step by step. Letting go doesn't mean giving up ambition or passion. It means loosening the grip that turns these natural energies into sources of stress. When we learn to desire without attachment, we can pursue what matters with calm focus rather than frantic urgency. One of the Buddha's most profound teachings, the practice of non-attachment, invites us to embrace life's flow with openness. We learn to hold things lightly, appreciating them while they last and gracefully releasing them when they change or fade. This shift brings freedom. Without the heavy weight of craving, our pace naturally slows. We no longer rush to fill an inner void but move through life with ease and intention. This freedom from attachment is a cornerstone of slow living in the Buddhist sense. By understanding desire and attachment as the true engines of hurry, we gain powerful insight into our habits and motivations. This awareness lights the way toward a more peaceful, measured life, one where moments are savored rather than swallowed by the rush. As we continue this journey, we will explore how the Buddha's middle way guides us to balance action and stillness, finding a rhythm that honors both our need to engage with life and our need to rest within it. Life often feels like a tug of war between extremes. On one side, there's relentless doing, hustling, chasing, striving to reach the next milestone. On the other, there's withdrawal, a tempting escape into quiet solitude, stillness, or even avoidance of life's challenges. Both extremes, however, can lead us away from the peace we seek. This is where the Buddha's wisdom shines with timeless clarity, the middle way. The middle way is not just a concept. It's a living practice that invites us to find harmony between action and stillness, between effort and ease. It calls us to walk a path that avoids the traps of excess and deficiency, neither frenzied busyness nor passive stagnation. Imagine life as a dance, a delicate interplay between movement and pause. Too much movement without pause exhausts the body and mind, burning out our energy and drowning out awareness. Too much stillness without movement can lead to stagnation, disconnection, or even despair. The Buddha discovered this balance through his own journey, from years of extreme asceticism to a more balanced approach that embraced nourishment and moderation. This insight led him to awaken and to teach that true freedom arises when we skillfully navigate between extremes. In the practice of slow living, the middle way becomes a guiding compass. It encourages us to engage fully with life's responsibilities, relationships, and passions, while also honoring our need for rest, reflection, and rejuvenation. This balance is found in mindful action, where every task is done with full presence, not as a hurried chore but as a meaningful expression of life. It's found in moments of stillness that aren't escapes but intentional pauses to reconnect with ourselves and the world. The middle way teaches us that slowing down doesn't mean stopping. It means moving with awareness, purpose, and grace. It's about choosing actions that nourish the body and mind, and cultivating rest that refreshes rather than dulls. This harmony also extends to how we handle emotions and thoughts. Rather than suppressing feelings or getting swept away by them, we learn to meet them with balanced awareness, acknowledging their presence without losing ourselves. By embracing the middle way, we dissolve the false dichotomy of rushing versus withdrawing. Instead, we enter a space where life flows with natural rhythm, where effort and surrender dance together. As this rhythm unfolds, the pace of life slows, not because the world has changed, but because we have learned to move in tune with its pulse. The middle way becomes the art of living fully, with calm energy and compassionate presence. In the chapters ahead, we will explore practical ways to embody this balance, through mindful habits, compassionate choices, and a deepening connection to the present moment. Life is not meant to be lived in isolation. Even in our moments of quiet reflection and stillness, we are woven into the fabric of relationships, family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers. The Buddha understood this deeply. He taught that compassion, karuna, and connection are essential to true living, and they play a vital role in the art of slow living. In a world that encourages speed and individualism, it's easy to forget how slowing down creates space for genuine connection. When we rush, our interactions become shallow, a blur of half-hearted greetings, distracted conversations, and missed opportunities for empathy. But slowing down changes this. Slow living with others means showing up fully, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. It means listening deeply, with open hearts and undivided attention. It means allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and offering kindness without expectation. Compassion, in the Buddha's teachings, is much more than a feeling. It's an active practice, a deliberate choice to recognize the suffering of others and respond with care. When we slow down, we become more attuned to the subtle signs of pain or joy in those around us. This attunement invites us to act with warmth and generosity. There's a beautiful reciprocity here. The more compassion we cultivate, the more connected we feel. And the more connected we feel, the richer our experience of life becomes. Slow living nurtures this cycle, creating a foundation of trust and belonging. Consider the simple act of sharing a meal with someone. In the rush of life, it may be just about nourishment, grabbing food quickly, eyes on the phone. But in slow living, a shared meal becomes a sacred ritual of presence, gratitude, and relationship building. The Buddha's community, the Sangha, was founded on this principle of compassionate connection. It was a space where people supported one another on the path, embracing both their strengths and struggles. This sense of community can inspire us today to slow down and cultivate relationships that heal and uplift. Importantly, compassion also extends inward. The Buddha taught that we must first cultivate kindness toward ourselves before we can genuinely extend it to others. Slow living invites us to be patient with our own imperfections and to treat ourselves with the same care we offer to loved ones. In practicing compassion and connection, slow living becomes not just a personal journey, but a shared experience. It transforms relationships into vessels of healing and growth, making life richer and more meaningful. As we slow down with others, we rediscover what it means to be truly human, interdependent, vulnerable, and deeply connected. From here, our path naturally leads us to explore how cultivating wisdom deepens this journey, allowing us to navigate life's challenges with clarity and grace. One of the Buddha's most profound insights is the truth of impermanence, that all things, without exception, are in a constant state of change. This includes our bodies, our emotions, our relationships, and even our thoughts. Nothing remains fixed or permanent, and understanding this is key to unlocking the art of slow living. At first, the idea of impermanence can feel unsettling. We cling to what we love, resist what we fear, and seek security in the illusion of permanence. This clinging fuels anxiety and hurry, a frantic attempt to hold on tightly before everything slips away. But the Buddha invites us to see impermanence not as a source of fear, but as a doorway to freedom. When we truly accept that everything changes, we can begin to let go of resistance and cultivate peace within the ever-shifting flow of life. Slow living in the light of impermanence means learning to embrace each moment exactly as it is, without grasping, without pushing, without judgment. It means savoring the sweetness of a fleeting smile, the warmth of a gentle breeze, the quiet beauty of a sunset, knowing these moments are transient, precious, and uniquely alive. This acceptance deepens our connection to the present. Instead of being distracted by regrets of the past or worries about the future, we anchor ourselves in the here and now. We realize that the present moment, however brief, is where life truly unfolds. The Buddha's practice of mindfulness is inseparable from this teaching. Mindfulness trains us to observe the impermanent nature of thoughts and feelings as they arise and pass away. Through this awareness, we develop a gentle detachment, freeing ourselves from the chains of clinging. Paradoxically, embracing impermanence does not lead to apathy or disengagement. Instead, it ignites a profound appreciation for life's richness. When we know that moments will never come again, we are inspired to live fully and intentionally. In this way, impermanence becomes a teacher of gratitude. It invites us to slow down, to be present, and to honor the fleeting beauty of existence. As we cultivate this awareness, the pressure to hurry dissolves. We discover that peace is not a distant goal but a natural state accessible in every breath. With this newfound peace, we are ready to complete our journey, to bring all these teachings together and step into a life of slow living, grounded in wisdom, compassion, and mindful presence. As our journey through the Buddhist teachings on slow living draws to a close, we arrive at a profound truth. Slow living is not merely a lifestyle choice. It is a path, one that leads us toward awakening. Awakening is the gentle unfolding of clarity, peace, and freedom within our own hearts. It is the gradual shedding of illusions that keep us rushing, grasping, and suffering. Through slow living, we learn to step out of the noise and hurry and into the radiant stillness of presence. This path asks for patience, compassion, and courage. It invites us to embrace life fully, with all its beauty and impermanence, to walk the middle way with balance and grace, and to cultivate connections that heal and sustain us. Slow living is not about perfection. It is about a sincere commitment to mindfulness, being awake to each moment, each breath, each interaction. It is about finding harmony between doing and being, action and rest, self and other. By embracing the Buddha's wisdom in our daily lives, we begin to taste a freedom that transcends circumstance, a freedom born not from controlling life, but from flowing with it. If this journey resonates with you, I encourage you to explore these teachings further and to bring slow living into your own life. Remember, awakening is not a destination but a continuous unfolding. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If you found this exploration meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us grow this community, bringing more light and wisdom to those seeking peace in a fast-paced world. May your path be gentle, your heart open, and your life full of mindful presence. Until next time, keep walking the path of slow living with awareness and compassion.